Welcome to Echoes of My Imagination. My name is Tracy Lee. Sit back, relax, let me tell you a story. Today's story is part 2 of The Lost Currents of Atlantis and Mu, written by Tracy Lee T. Thompson. In the ancient long noon of Earth, Mu lived in quiet harmony with the planet's living pulse, until the builders of Atlantis, guided by the mysterious architects, severed that current and set their great stone empire on the slow path to ruin. Let's get into it. Chapter 6. The long noon ended, not with fire or flood, but disharmony. For centuries, Atlanteans had traveled to Mu to soften themselves, submerging in the mud pools, letting the mineral-rich, electrically charged waters retune their bodies. It was a form of meditation, a reconnection with the planet's pulse. The skin would shimmer, bones flex like wet reeds, and their eyes would take in unimaginable frequencies. The planet's heartbeat existed within them, renewing them in every way. Over time, Atlanteans stopped visiting Mu to soften themselves. They wanted to replicate the Lemurian mud pools within the stone cities. The Atlanteans dug deep basins, lined them with fused stone, and tried to replicate every nuance of Mu's pressure, minerals, and violet energy. But no matter how precise, the pulse was wrong. The Atlanteans tried draining natural mud pools to power the stone labs, but it remained a copy of life, not life itself. Humans in these labs would float in mineral baths, expecting to shimmer as they had in Mu, only to find themselves cold, heavy, and disconnected. Some laughed at the failure, others cried, feeling the subtle wrongness, the tiny electric gap between their bodies and the earth. Control was replacing connection. And yet, Mu still lived. Hidden beneath the Pacific basin, its mud pools glimmered under dense violet skies. Forests spiraled in perfect conductivity, and Lemurians hummed to the water and air, keeping the planet's pulse alive. They laughed in the mud pools, moved like liquid dancers through forests, and marveled at the simple perfection of life. Atlanteans occasionally traveled there, seeking solace, a reminder of the pulse, though fewer and fewer made the journey. Those that did noticed each journey only reinforced the contrast. Atlantis was about control, measurement, mastery. Atlanteans marched in deliberate order, their eyes fixed on stone and metal, and the rigid perfection of geometry. It was a balance, fragile and essential, and the architects knew it. They did not care about harmony. They thrived in manipulation, subtle subversion, and control. Chapter 7. The architects, observing the fracture they had begun, looked to the surface world. Humanity was still young, still pliable. The techniques perfected in Atlantis, the harnessing of energy, the solidification of life into measurable forms, would eventually be exported. Egypt, the first attempts at structured civilization on the Nile, would be merely an echo, a copy, a partial reconstruction of what the architects would perfect in Atlantis. They would teach humans to mimic the Atlantean mastery of stone and energy, not to connect, but to control. Pyramids, obelisks, and temples would become instruments, not homes, mirrors of the ancient betrayal. The Atlanteans had already lost the pulse. Their skin no longer shimmered with the mineral breath of Mu. Their bones had become rigid, their senses dulled to the soft vibrations of the planet. But the architects were not content with observation alone. They sought to reshape life itself. In high crystal-lit laboratories, Perched on the jagged cliffs of the Atlantic ridge, Atlanteans began the first synthetic births. Gone were the mud pools, gone the gentle soak in mineral-laden water. Instead, children were born in vats of concentrated liquids, heated and pulsed by electric arcs. The hum of energy filled the room, a sound both exhilarating and terrifying. The infants were fragile at first, tiny bodies molded by sound and voltage. Their eyes flickered with the faintest violet glint, but they never felt the ground beneath, no sensation of earth, no heartbeat of the planet. They were a solid state, untethered, perfect but hollow. This was not cruelty, it was engineering. The Lemurians, still distant in their Pacific haven, could sense the shift. A tremor of wrongness rippled through the mud pools. Trees shivered in response. Leviathans paused mid-swim, unsure of the pulse that had always guided them. Even the children noticed a slight stiffness in their play. Life in Mew was alive, responsive, but dimmed. Chapter 8. They arrived quietly, tall, angular, and impossibly precise. The architects moved through the ridges and lowlands like shadows of cold air, their bodies both familiar and alien. Their skin, neither soft nor reflective, had the hard sheen of polished mineral. Their eyes, narrow and calculating, shimmered with an inner geometry, as though they perceived the world in angles, frequencies, and lines no one else could see. Where Atlantean-shaped stone was sound, the architects bent it with intent. They did not build for life. They built for dominance. Towers rose where none should stand, slicing the horizon with crystalline sharpness, their ley wires piercing the earth's crust to siphon energy with ruthless precision. Each structure hummed with a deliberate note, a frequency designed not to sustain, but to extract, to control. At first, the architects were admired, even loved. They demonstrated feats of architecture and power that stunned the Atlanteans, towers that held constant storms in their domes, water that flowed uphill, entire streets suspended in shimmering force fields. The architects did not command the energy, they redirected it. Mew watched first. From its lowlands, its mud pools thick with mineral breath, its trees spiraling toward the sky, their leaves vibrating gently with the pulse of the world. Lemurians noticed the subtle vibrations stilled where the architect's structures pierced the earth. Currents hesitated. The living flow dimmed further. And yet the architects spoke in manners that seduced rather than threatened. They offered knowledge, techniques to improve the pulse, to enhance the power of stone. Atlanteans, already on the path of control, were seduced most easily. They welcomed the architect's designs, their precise angles, their glyphs and programs etched into crystals. The amplifiers became sharper, the ley wires deeper. Certain guilds were coerced to work for the architect's designs, redirecting energy to central points, ley lines rerouted to feed singular towers instead of the planetary pulse. The Atlanteans, in pursuit of mastery, did not see that they were no longer the stewards of the earth. They were becoming conduits for something else. The architects taught the Atlanteans to redirect energy, to sever the pulse, to harden themselves. They moved like surgeons of the planet, severing the natural loops and replacing them with linear flows. They introduced isolation where there was once circulation. Pools that had breathed with life were walled. Currents that had sung with growth were channeled, muted, rerouted. Birth, once a song in the mineral waters, became a process of control. Children were nurtured in synthetic basins, disconnected from the earth's pulse, severed from the living flow. They felt solidity before spirit, independence before connection. The architects laughed at their own subtle jokes, a humor as dry as desert stone, as they watched the Atlanteans perfect their own cages. Every new crystal tower, every lay wire, every synthetic child was another note in their symphony of misdirection. And yet, humor and mischief lingered in the Atlantean streets. The architects were careful. They were patient. They worked through admiration and desire, planting structures that whispered of greatness, but demanded obedience. Slowly, the world tilted. The pulse slowed where it had once flowed freely, and the circuits that connected sky, surface, and deep began to hum with strain. Mu began to fade, not entirely, but its soft, vibrant life lost some of its vitality. Mu was no longer a place in balance. The air was thinner, the stone heavier, the water colder in spirit, if not in warmth. Through the architect's guidance, the Atlanteans began to forget Mu. They stopped traveling to the mud pools. The architects inserted themselves as gods, creating temples, rituals, and systems of worship. They twisted the pulse, restrained and muted, now that only lived in Mu itself. The architects had ensured that the connection was fragile, fleeting, or entirely absent. They imposed hierarchy and fear. Egypt, the pyramids, the ritual sites scattered across the world. They were attempts to rebuild the connection under the architect's guidance, but the pure pulse of Mu was lost. The planet was segmented into grids, controlled centers, and manipulated energy lines. The first desync had occurred. A choice had been made not by force, but by temptation, by persuasion, to replace the living flow with engineered programs, to place will above pulse. And the architects watched, their angles sharp, their lines precise, knowing the breach had begun. Chapter 9. The earth whispered at first, a subtle shiver through roots and stone. The Lemurians felt it in the mud pools, a hesitation in the warmth of their veins. The water, usually thick and humming with mineral resonance, pulsed unevenly. Something had shifted, a weight in the circuits that connected the sky, the surface, the deep. The architects were already at work. From the ridge tops of Atlantis, their spires siphoned the flow of the planet like invisible fingers. Lay wires carved channels into the crust, diverting the pulse into their crystalline machines. Atlanteans cheered at the efficiency, the newfound ability to hold the stone in perfect form, to command water, to illuminate the air with perpetual violet light. They did not feel the theft. They only felt the power. Mu, however, began to suffer. The sky canopy faltered, the atmospheric weavers noticing a subtle tension in the violet breath. Clouds thickened too long in one place. Rainfall became uneven, unpredictable. The floating geo-islands quivered as if they sensed the circuit disruption, and deep in the earth, the lithic custodians struggled to maintain the great artery. The soft harmony of their crystalline cathedrals became strained, the piezoelectric lights flickering in rhythm with the failing pulse. The leviathans of the ocean, great capacitors of life, began to breach less frequently. Their giant bodies carried the charge from deep vents to surface waters, but the energy they received now flowed unevenly. The glass reefs, living fiber optic networks spanning leagues, flickered and dimmed, as if confused by the interference. The deep trenches of the Etharo mariners grew cold in places. currents slowing, towers trembling. Atlanteans celebrated their mastery, unaware that the power they wielded was borrowed from the world itself. They had begun to emulate the Lemurians' mud pools in stone laboratories, but the synthetic waters lacked the pulse, the living flow. Children born in these vats were the first of their kind, ungrounded, solid state, insulated from the heartbeat of the planet. They felt independence, but not connection. They felt command, but not the song of the world. The first great cracks appeared. A tower of fused stone hummed too loud, a frequency caught in discord with the earth's soft rhythm. A canal, once spiraling with vitality, stagnated. The architects watched with detached precision, noting where energy stilled, where resistance formed. They were not cruel, they were engineers, patient and exacting. But their designs required obedience. Life was no longer the director of the pulse. The architects had placed themselves at the center. In Mu, the Lemurians began to sense the betrayal, a gnawing unease in their bodies. The trees no longer spiraled with the same grace. The mud pools no longer held the warmth of the core. Traveling Atlanteans felt the difference immediately. Where once they could remineralize and soften, now the waters drained them, leaving a brittle hardness in the bones and a faint static in their nerves. The architects had not only redirected the flow, they had taught a new law. Energy could be captured, concentrated, and hoarded. The living flow of Mu, the harmonic circuits of Atlantis, both were now instruments for the will of something else entirely. And so, the worlds began to diverge irreversibly. Mu continued in quiet, fading pulses, a memory in motion, while Atlantis hardened, perfect in geometry but starved of life. The first echo of betrayal vibrated through the planet, a disharmony that would linger for millennia. Carried in stone, in water, in air, in the bones of those who had once belonged to the pulse. Chapter 10. Long after the first breach, when Mu's pulse had grown faint and uneven, the architects looked outward. The world still thrummed with potential, but only in fragments. Pockets of harmony scattered across oceans and mountains. It was here that the architects planted the seeds of their new order. The Atlanteans had become masters of solid-state power, their bodies dense, eyes sharp, and skin like polished bronze. They walked across the ridged plateau of the Atlantic with quiet authority, their quartz towers humming under the weight of captured energy. The air was thick with the violet glow of atmospheric lasing, and the scent of heated stone mingled with metallic tang, an aroma of mastery and cold calculation. But not all Atlanteans were content. A few, sensitive to the fractures in the world, still remembered Mu's soft resonance. They were drawn to distant lands, to the Nile Basin, where the earth's pulse lingered in quiet rivers and fertile delta soils. They came as observers, builders, manipulators, and eventually, unwittingly, as the founders of Egypt. Here the architects' influence began to emerge clearly. They instructed the Atlanteans in precise geometric forms, pyramids aligned with the stars, obelisks marking lay points, temples designed to control energy as much as to honor it. But these structures were more than monuments. They were early instruments of control, attempts to reproduce the stolen pulse in rigid form. The Nile itself seemed to comply, its waters guided into canals and reservoirs with uncanny precision. The air shimmered with the latent energy of the planet, concentrated into the stone works of men who had been severed from the living flow. Yet in the quiet, the rivers still remembered Mu. Every flood, every sediment, carried whispers of a softer, freer time, murmuring beneath the engineered perfection of the builders. Atlanteans working here felt the tension immediately. Their hands, once capable of coaxing stone and water into harmony, now strained to coax life into their pyramids. Crystal and granite could hold frequencies, yes, but the subtle currents of the earth refused to bend fully. Children born here were even further from the pulse, skin stiff, bones hard, senses dulled. They were the first true solid-state humans outside of the plateau, a living testament to what was lost. Yet humor and curiosity persisted amongst the builders. One Atlantean would tap a tuning rod against the pyramid's base and glance sideways, a grin beneath sharp violet eyes.
"I wonder if the river notices we are playing chess,"
he whispered to another, who laughed. A brief human sound that cut through the cold, ordered perfection. In time, Egypt became the laboratory of imitation. Every canal, every pyramid, every obelisk was an experiment in reproducing what Mu had always done effortlessly. But the living pulse could not be captured in still form. Stone, no matter how perfectly fused, no matter how finely etched with scripts of power, could only approximate the energy of a living world. And so, the architects watched, silent and patient, their influence threading through generations. They were not gods, but they positioned themselves to be worshipped. They taught structure, control, mastery, but always at the cost of the natural rhythm. Humanity learned obedience, but not connection. Civilization learned permanence, but not life. Mu faded further, a quiet spiral in the Pacific lowlands. Atlantis remained rigid, gleaming in geometric perfection. Egypt rose, a fragile echo of lost currents, guided by hands that had forgotten the song of the earth. And everywhere, the architects waited, calculating, ensuring the lesson was not lost. The pulse could be borrowed, but never returned without cost. And that's it for today. Thank you for joining me for Echoes of My Imagination. My name is Tracy Lee. Don't forget to subscribe, share, like, and follow, and tell your friends. And join me next time for part 3 of The Lost Currents of Atlantis and Mu.